Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is the 2035 report, How Low Costs Can Accelerate Our Clean Energy Future. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance on behalf of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. We have a number of excellent guest speakers with us today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can use a telephone or you can use your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console, you can do that by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also use that arrow to expand the webinar console. And one thing I would particularly like for you to notice on the webinar console is the questions box. We will be having a Q&A at the end of our presentations, and we would like to get to as many questions as possible. So please type your question in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. Type it in right when you think of it, and we'll get to as many as we can. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and the slides within about 48 hours. And we'll also post those materials on our website at cisa.org/webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over now to our moderator for today's webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he is going to tell you more about our webinar and introduce our guest speakers.
Hey, thanks you very much, Sam. Well, before I get to telling you about the webinar, I want to say a couple things about the Clean Energy States Alliance for those who are not familiar with us. We're a national nonprofit organization. We're a membership organization, and most of our members are state energy agencies. And you could see our members up here on the screen. And we do a lot of information sharing. We do group projects among our members. We do a variety of initiatives. And our most recent initiative is the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative, which is an effort to help those states that have adopted 100% clean energy goals or are thinking of adopting 100% clean energy goals, to allow them to share information, identify best practices, identify their challenges, and overcome their challenges. We've gotten a great response from all the states that have 100% clean energy goals. And in addition to convening meetings and discussions among those states, we're doing a variety of activities aimed at a broader audience. And that includes today's webinar, as well as we have a monthly newsletter with information about what's going on around the country related to state 100% clean energy efforts. But today we're really pleased to present a webinar on the topic, if you could go to the next slide, of the 2035 report. This report has gotten a lot of attention out there in the energy trade press. It's a very important research effort that was conducted by folks at University of California, Berkeley, and other organizations, including Energy Innovation and Grid Lab. And it really sketches out a very promising and reachable future for us. We're going to be hearing from three of the key authors of that report today, and I will turn it over to them in a minute, but I want to first introduce them to you. First, Rick O'Connell is Executive Director of Grid Lab, which is a national nonprofit that delivers technical assistance to advocates and regulators. It's a connectivity platform to facilitate knowledge sharing and education on best practices for complex grid issues. Since its founding in 2017, Grid Lab has executed 55 projects across 25 states, working with a network of more than 65 experts and partnering with over 30 independent organizations. Rick's a recognized leader in renewable energy technology and policy, having provided engineering support for over 8 gigawatts of utility-scale solar projects, and he's led many high-profile policy studies. Our second speaker will be Amal Fadaki, who's a senior scientist, and he's a senior scientist and also an affiliate of the Goldman School of Public Policy at University of California, Berkeley. His research broadly focuses on energy technology, economics, markets, and regulation. A lot of his work currently focuses on grid-scale battery storage, heavy-duty electric vehicles, deep renewable energy penetration in the India's power sector, and appliance and equipment efficiency. He's published over 80 journal articles, research reports, and conference papers. He regularly advises the national government of India, as well as utilities and regulators there. He has a Bachelor's of Engineering degree and an MS and PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley. And our third speaker will be Mike O'Boyle, who's Director of Electricity Policy for Energy Innovation. He works for the firm's Power Sector Transformation Program to uncover policies that support a clean, reliable, and affordable U.S. electricity system. He's worked with utility regulators and legislators from states around the country to improve the link between public policy goals and electric utility incentives. He updates policymakers on technological developments and policy levers to promote investment and to promote clean energy transformation that improves affordability and reliability. So I will turn it over to them and write in your questions as you come up with them, because we will have time for questions at the end. Thank you. So Rick, it's up to you.
Great, thank you so much, Warren. I appreciate that excellent introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here speaking with you all today. Really excited to talk about this report that we recently released that's been a long time in the making. I think Amol and I first talked about this in May of 2019. So we're excited that it's I think reframed a conversation that we've been having in this country that I think all of you are involved in around how to get to higher penetrations of clean energy in our economy and across our states. So I think Warren did a fantastic job of introducing, but I'll just quickly say that this was a real collaborative effort between Grid Lab, UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy, Climate Nexus, who did all of our communications and really helped us with sort of framing, and Energy Innovation. Michael Boyle's here to speak for Energy Innovation, that published a companion policy piece. So the report that Amol and myself and others wrote and published really focuses on the technical and economic feasibility of getting to 90% clean. And Mike's piece really talked about what policies we would need to get us there. So that's our talk for you today. So I'm going to just start off and give you a quick introduction. Amol is going to take you through the technical and economic impacts. I'm going to talk a little bit about jobs and environmental, and then Mike's going to talk about the policy, and we're going to leave plenty of time for folks to ask questions, because I think people will have, hopefully you'll spur some good discussion and questions. So why did we do this? Why is there another national study on decarbonizing the electrical grid? You know, as we all know, the electrical grid is about 1/3 of the contributor to greenhouse gas. We also think of all the sectors in our economy, it's the one with the clearest line of sight. In other words, we've got the technology in place to mostly decarbonize it. And while we're super thrilled that all the folks, you folks on the phone, lots of states have either passed or are in the process of passing, incredible 100% targets. One of the concerns we had was a lot of these 100% targets were well out into mid-century, so sort of 2045 or 2050. And a lot of times, especially in the technical world, technical and academic world, people sort of jump straight to the, well, it's going to be very difficult to decarbonize that last 10 or 20% of the electrical grid. And we really wanted to sort of reframe the debate and really say, well, what can we do in the near term with the technology we have? You know, what's the clear pathway to getting to a clean grid in the near term, and giving us plenty of time for research and development and other thinking to sort of decarbonize the last 10 or 20%. And just to be very clear here, when we talk about clean energy, we're including existing renewable energy. So we're including existing hydro, existing nuclear. There's some, you know, a small amount of nuclear retirements between now and 2035 in our modeling, but we're really including existing clean energy. So I think, yeah, and then we really wanted to look at the health and the economic impacts of this pathway. So I think with that introduction, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Amol, who's going to walk you through the thinking and what really some of the key changes in the marketplace that drove the work that we're doing. Amol?
All right, thanks, Rick. First, thank you for the opportunity to present to this group, and I'm really excited, and thanks everybody for joining. Really appreciate you listening in. So I'm going to begin with what kind of prompted us to do this study. What we were seeing in the marketplace was that the solar, wind, and storage costs were falling much faster than several experts had anticipated. We saw this interesting bids of Xcel Energy of solar or renewables plus storage coming in at 2 to 3 cents per kWh, and there are several such examples. What I'm showing on the figure here is that the standard kind of technology benchmark we use, or cost benchmark we use, the NREL's annual technology baseline projections, and as you can see that every year these projections have been revised downwards, and the changes have been very dramatic. So if you just compare the ATB 2015 projection and what they projected the cost would be in 2030 or 2050, those cost reductions are already here. And this is not just true for NREL's ATB, but multiple studies have revised their projection downwards, and whatever they projected the cost to be in 2030, say just a few years ago, are already here. So in summary, what we were seeing is that the cost reductions have arrived kind of 15 to 20 years earlier than expected just a few years ago. So now the question is, if the costs have fallen dramatically or fallen faster, then how does that change the prospect of the early decarbonization? So if the costs have fallen 15 years earlier, what about the cost and economics of decarbonizing, say, by 2035, which is more in line with what we need to do for climate? So this was kind of the genesis of the study. And as you can see on the next slide, these are the dramatic cost declines. And we then basically said that let's use the latest kind of technology projections from NREL's, which is NREL's 2019 annual technology baseline with some modifications to see what is the cost and technology and economics of 90% clean grid in the US. So what I'm showing on the figure are the three scenarios we modeled. Essentially, the low cost scenario matches exactly is the NREL's annual technology baseline low case scenario. Our base case scenario is actually a modification of their mid case scenario, which essentially uses the low cost scenario until 2021, because the PPA prices, the latest PPA prices, indicate the costs are actually following the low cost trajectory. But as you can see, our study does not depend on kind of making heroic assumptions of future cost reductions. We are kind of using the standard NREL annual technology baselines with some modifications. The other thing I would point out is that most of the cost reductions have already occurred. Yes, there are some future cost reductions that are projected in the study, but those are minor relative to what have already occurred. Next slide. So then essentially what we did was we used basically standard modeling tools. So we used NREL's Reads model, which they have graciously made publicly available. It's a fantastic tool, and a lot of investment has gone into making that model, and several key studies from NREL and DOE have been published using that model. So we use that model as a capacity expansion model, but to capture the kind of the dependability of the system, or making sure that the hourly constraints are met, considering several operational constraints, we used Plexos, which is again an industry standard tool to evaluate the operational feasibility of the system. So those are kind of the tools that we used. And the first question people ask us is that if the costs have fallen so much, why do we have to do anything? What would happen without any new additional policy? And that's the scenario we run. We call that a no new policy scenario, which is shown on the right-hand side of the figure. And essentially, although the cost of renewables have fallen, natural gas is also very inexpensive, natural gas-based generation, and a lot of the gas asset is already built. So it's pretty inexpensive to run the existing natural gas plants. So in the absence of no new policy, what we find is that essentially the clean energy share increases, but doesn't increase dramatically. Even the costs have fallen significantly. So without no new policy, we are at a clean share just above 50% by 2035, which is highly inconsistent with what we need to do for climate. And then we model a policy case which basically forces the system to identify a least cost pathway in reads to meet a 90% clean energy, clean electricity goal. And that is shown on the left-hand side. And there are no big surprises here. Is essentially a combination of solar, wind, existing nuclear, and hydro that makes the bunch of most of the clean energy mix. So about 70% is provided by wind and solar. The rest, 10% is by nuclear, 10% is by hydro, and the rest 10% is by gas approximately. And the wind solar share is really as a function of the wind solar relative cost. So don't read too much into it. We have, for example, for 80 below, you see a higher share of solar. But that's kind of generally as you can see, the gas generation drops significantly compared to today. And we don't build any new coal plants or gas plants, and the coal generation is basically eliminated. Next slide. So those are the two scenarios we modeled. Then the first question, or the second question people ask is that, okay, how is the grid balanced on an hourly basis, especially during those low periods of really cloudy weather or dramatic declines in wind energy? How are you making sure that the system is balanced? And we take this question very seriously. We modeled the US power system into 135 zones, but we conduct an hourly simulation for 7 weather years. So that's about 60,000 hours worth of simulation for each 134 zones, abiding by individual constraints of about 15,000 plus generators. And we look at what I'm showing you is kind of the max gas generation week in that 7 weather year simulation period. And what we find is that what people say is actually true, that renewables fall significantly compared to their average value. So in the lowest period, renewables drop as much as 70% compared to their average value. And in those weeks, essentially the system is balanced by we find about 150 gigawatts of 4-hour storage to be cost effective. So a combination of hydro, nuclear, 150 gigawatts of storage, and about 350 gigawatts of existing gas kind of is used to balance the system. And that gas asset is already built and it's used highly infrequently. I call it the excellent babysitter, which is already kind of mostly paid for. So it does play an important role in terms of providing that backup, but in combination with hydro, nuclear, and battery storage. Now, this is a one conservative approach of seeing how the system can be balanced. There can be much, more economical or smarter strategies, including demand response and several other things that can be used to balance the system. And we feel that eventually even this 10% gas can be replaced to get to 100%, because there are several technologies in the pipeline that look promising, but those can be simultaneously developed. One doesn't have to wait for them to be developed and actually reach a 90% clean electricity share by 2035. So it's like a heavy down payment on our long-term goal of 100%. Next slide. So this is the result that we are most excited about. Our hypothesis that if the costs have fallen so dramatically, what would be the cost of a 90% clean grid, especially in the context of really tight consumer budgets? So this is where what we find, we basically consider wholesale power cost. We don't do any changes to the distribution side of the system. So wholesale power costs primarily include generation costs, but in a significant amount of incremental transmission cost. So it's kind of a representative for wholesale cost. And our observation, our finding is that the wholesale power cost in 2035 for a clean grid will actually be 10% lower than the wholesale or comparable wholesale power cost today. And this does not take into account the environmental benefits of the clean system. And we did calculate those considering the air pollution damage, environmental and health damage cost of air pollution, and also the cost of carbon. And once you add those in, those add about 2 cents per kWh to the cost of no new policy. And as you can see, if you add the environmental cost, the 90% clean case cost is overwhelmingly lower than the no new policy case cost. You could also see that if you just look at 90%, compare the 90% clean case cost in 2035 with no new policy cost, that it is actually in fact slightly higher. And that is obvious because if the 90% clean cost was actually lower than the no new policy case cost, then it would have happened on its own. But the point is that we could confidently say that, at least based on this analysis, that the consumer cost will not go up compared to today, and it will have huge environmental benefits, including 85,000 premature deaths avoided, and which totals to, considering a climate benefit, up to 1.2 kind of $1 trillion worth of environmental damage avoided. So that's, I think, pretty significant. I think it is significant from two perspectives. First, given the consumer tight budgets for consumers, to say that a 90% clean case will not increase bills that is significant. And the second thing is, remember that the power sector from a climate perspective is only 1/3 of the battle, or little over 1/3 of the battle. The key for decarbonization, as several studies have shown, is through electrification. And to have electrification, to electrify transport and buildings and industry, it's quite critical to have not only clean power, but also cheap power. So I think this 90% clean framing achieves kind of the sweet spot of cheap and clean and near-term clean power. So that's the finding that we are most excited about. And I'm going to hand it over to Rick, who's going to walk you through some of the other exciting stuff on environment and jobs and feasibility. Over to you, Rick.
Great, thank you so much, Amol. I appreciate that. And I think, look, when Amol was talking about the costs, he covered this, pretty well. So I'm going to move quickly. But as most of you know, despite the Clean Air Act and other things, our environmental externalities are not fully internalized, and especially coal has pretty significant emissions, not just carbon, but also SOx, NOx, PM2.5, which have significant environmental damage. We sometimes forget this in the focus on carbon, and it's pretty obvious in the 90% clean case that we produce really significant health benefits. So from carbon as well as from particulates, and as well as avoiding about 85,000 premature deaths. So pretty significant environmental as we essentially retire all the coal in the country in the next 15 years and ramp down gas generation about 70%. I think, Amol did a great job of sort of, answering the concerns about this. And one of the concerns that we hear a lot is sort of, well, how are we going to be able to build that much wind and solar? And to give you guys a little bit of background, we were looking at 90% by 2035, but we did some early modeling looking at different target years and different target percentages. So we looked at 80% by 2030, 80% and 90% by both 2030 and 2035. And one of the nice things about 2035 is it gives you a little bit more time to sort of build out what is, 1,200 gigawatts of wind, solar, and storage, so about 1,100, which is a pretty significant build out. And while it's significant, it's also not outside of the realm of possibility. So in the 2020s, this build out is about 2x our current rate of wind and solar deployment. So it's about 70 gigawatts a year of wind and solar on average through the 15 years. It's about 2x deployment in the 2020s and about 3x deployment in the 2030s. I think this year we're probably going to install about 20 gigawatts of wind. I think at peak year we installed about 16 gigawatts of solar. So that's 35. So we're already kind of halfway there, and we're pretty confident. NREL and DOE and others have done a lot of work on the supply chain. And I think Mike's going to talk a little bit more about sort of everyone has questions about land impact. I think one of the things that's really important, and Amol mentioned this, but one of the things that low cost renewables buys you is also geographic diversity. So I think 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, the sort of conventional wisdom is that you built renewables, you built solar in the sunny Southwest, you built wind in the windy Midwest, you built transmission to access those high quality renewables because, in other parts of the country, the capacity factors weren't as good and prices were 20, 30% higher. Well, prices are still 20, 30% higher, but now it's, the difference between the sunny Southwest and cloudy Michigan is the difference between, 3 cents and 4 cents or 2 cents and 3 cents. It doesn't matter anymore, right? When the difference was 8 cents and 8 cents to 12 cents, it absolutely mattered. So even though the percentage hasn't changed, the absolute difference between high quality resource and a less than high quality resource has really come down. And so that also helps this issue in the sense that you can build wind and solar in much more places across the country. There's not just concentrated in a few places. This also meant that we, in our modeling, we built, a lot less transmission than maybe some earlier studies had looked at as needing large transmission. We still had a pretty significant investment in transmission, about $90 billion in transmission. But that was mainly in sort of regional transmission and not a lot of interregional. Now that's just one output from reads from the modeling. You could have different approaches to doing this build out, as Amol talked about, in terms of, a lot of the gas that we're leaving online, you could be most likely replaced with storage or demand response or, shiftable loads. But in general, I think the important thing is that we feel confident that the capacity additions, the build out of renewables that we're looking at is not unreasonable. And then the other thing that build out of renewables does is it really creates a huge employment opportunity. And I think Mike's going to talk more about this, especially in the context of COVID, as being pretty important. But if you're building 1,200 gigawatts of wind, solar, and storage, which is essentially doubling the entire capacity installed on the grid today in the US, you're going to end up with creating a lot of construction and manufacturing jobs. So as jobs, as employment sort of shifts in the energy sector, as you retire fossil plants that have maybe kind of more jobs per megawatt than wind and solar, especially on the operations and maintenance, and obviously fuel handling and upstream and midstream fuel. So you are going to lose some jobs on the fossil side, but those are going to be more than made up for, especially in the construction of this pretty significant build out. And it's to the tune of about half a million jobs a year over the next 15 years. So pretty significant, and that's really important from a policymaker perspective, looking at the employment shifts. And I think that there's, Mike can talk a little bit more about the policies, making sure that that employment is also qualitatively the same, because it's important that as we shift employment in the sector, that the quality remains the same, or that those jobs that are lost, the jobs that are created are as high quality, if not higher quality, than the ones that are lost. And so I think I've mentioned a few times things that Mike's going to talk about. So I'm going to hand it off to Mike O'Boyle from Energy Innovation, who's going to talk about the policy recommendations in their companion piece that tie in with the work that Amol, myself, and the rest of the team worked on. So Mike, take it away.
Thanks, Rick, and hi, everyone. For those of you not familiar with Energy Innovation, we work with state and federal policymakers to help design policies that mitigate carbon emissions across sectors. So I'm only going to briefly cover what's in the policy report, so we have time for Q&A, but feel free to reach out afterwards if anything strikes a chord and you want to talk through some of the details either in the policy report or otherwise. I'll also just mention that the reports are available online at 2035report.com. So just wanted to let you guys know where to find that stuff. So clean electricity, we really see this because of the employment figures that we've seen, that this is a major engine for economic recovery from the COVID crisis. And so it creates new jobs and the justification for new infrastructure and public spending, while not increasing costs for customers as people are, struggling to pay their bills. So really, we think a win-win, and also timely due to the economic crisis right now. Next slide. So one of the main findings of the report is that investment and tax credits alone will not get us there. We recommend as an overarching policy, a national clean energy standard in line with the study that ramps up over time, starting with 55% by 2025, 75% by 2030, 90% by 2035, and 100% by 2045. The study shows we can get to 90% by 2035 without increasing customer costs, and then that leaves a realistic timeline, to get the nation from 90 to 100%. But also key here, I think, is that this policy should be flexible enough to support states that want to go faster. and many states have already committed to 100% clean energy, and utilities as well. So, a key complement to the national standard, or in the absence of the national standard, is increased state ambition. Next slide. But additional policy levers are needed to realize this vision, both at the state and federal level. I think some of the biggest challenges are highlighted in the analysis that Rick and Amol shared. How do we scale the manufacturing capacity and deployment capacity of the US? How do we handle the winners and losers, particularly coal and fossil reliant communities? And then where do we put all of this generation? These are key questions that I think policy has a major role to play. So to that first question, we recommend that we reinstate the advanced manufacturing tax credit from the ARRA to support domestic manufacturing. That's section 48C, a 30% investment tax credit. We think it will really help support domestic production and US manufacturing jobs that also support the deployment and construction jobs. Our current manufacturing capacity is about 9 gigawatts for wind domestically and about 7 for solar. So, there's major space between that and what we need to deploy. And if those jobs can be domestic, I think all the better. We also recommend increasing DOE funding to provide low-cost financing to clean energy manufacturers as a complementary policy. And then the issue of stranded assets comes up with the financial analysis that is in the appendix of the report. So there are, I would say, billions in unrecovered, undepreciated costs for coal, and those costs will be highly concentrated in areas where regulated utilities have made recent large investments, either in new generation in the 2000s or in pollution control upgrades. And so if you're looking at phasing out coal completely by 2035, customers are on the hook for a lot of that beyond 2035. And so, and of course, some of these plants will retire much sooner. And I mean, personally, I see the coal market collapsing perhaps on its own around on that timeline. So this is a major issue where the federal and state governments can collaborate and play a role. The issue of securitization as a potential policy has really proliferated in Western states, and I think is a major opportunity at the state level to reduce the cost of paying back utilities for that investment from their regulated rate of return in the 9 to 11% range down to about 3%, which you can get for ratepayer-backed bonds and can pay it off over a longer period of time. We need to also take care of the coal workers and support the communities through the coal transition. In particular, along with those ratepayer-backed bonds, we need to provide stopgap funding to supplement the tax base provided by retired coal infrastructures so that local services don't collapse in those communities. We need to shore up indebted federal programs that sustain coal worker pensions and healthcare. Another way to invest in those communities is through environmental remediation. And there's a major opportunity to employ folks with similar skill sets for a few years after those plants retire. And then we also propose increasing federal and or state tax incentives for wind and solar development if those plants are sited near coal communities and also can train and employ local workers. We also have quite a bit of information in the policy brief on how to make sure that the labor standards make sure that those jobs are quality, provide similar benefits, et cetera. But it's worth noting that a previous study by Energy Innovation and another clean energy modeler, Vibrant Clean Energy, found that local wind and solar near coal plants is cheaper. New wind and solar plants are cheaper than the cost of operating existing coal in more than 2/3 of coal plants in the United States. This is a report we called the coal cost crossover. And that trend is only accelerating with the cost declines that Amol discussed at the beginning of his presentation. So, a lot of these replacements, won't necessarily result in increased rates locally. And there are opportunities all over the country, especially with the addition of storage, to make those plants work in local coal communities. And then there's one other model that's emerging in Colorado at the state level, which is to create a just transition office. to manage all of these pieces and to engage those communities and understand what they need. We think a collaboration between federal and state policymakers to manage that transition could be really productive. And then finally, there are a lot of agency actions that are needed from FERC in reforming wholesale markets and improving interconnection queues and getting some of the 500 gigawatts that are currently in interconnection queues actually on the grid, improving transmission planning. DOE and the national labs can provide a lot of technical assistance to states and utilities, and the Department of Interior has a huge role to play in streamlining siting and identifying the best places in the country to site, connecting transmission lines and wind and solar in high quality areas. As far as state policy is concerned, apart from these sort of pillars of the policy report, I wanted to just note that we spend some time talking about utility business model reform and the need to engage with demand side resources like efficiency and demand response that can really complement the renewable energy transition and reduce costs even further than what was modeled by UC Berkeley. Those technologies are sort of lightly used, if at all, by the model, and there's major economic potential there. We also want to make sure that utilities reform their procurement practices to be more competitive, and also that states examine a regional approach to clean energy policy and transmission planning, because the regional approach is what enables some of that low cost and power sharing. So I think I'll stop there and open up for Q&A, which I think Warren is moderating, but thank you all for your time and look forward to engaging.
Hey, thank you very much, Rick, Amal, and Mike. Those are very good presentations. We have a lot of questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can, and just so folks know, we may run over about 5 minutes to give time for us to get to a lot of these questions. The first one, you presented national results of the costs and the mix of electricity sources. Where would somebody see regional or state results from your study?
Yeah, that's a great question, Warren. And so we actually have a great website, 2035report.com, that has a data explorer that includes a way where you can actually look at regional, you can look at regional results, both on gigawatt hours and gigawatts, as well as even state level results. And we're also going to be publishing an appendix in the next few days that goes further into detail on our methodology and our approach, and we'll also include all those. But I strongly recommend folks after this webinar to check out the Data Explorer, and hopefully that's useful for your states, your regions, to be able to dig in and see what a 90% clean system would look like for your state or your region.
Yeah, just to add to that, this is Amal. We look at the mixes, but we don't actually estimate the costs at the regional or at the state level because of complications related to how doing more deep dive into counting for imports and exports and cost allocations. But we are definitely interested in follow-up work which does deep dive into costs and other questions at a more granular level. But this national study gives you an idea, at least, of the resource mix.
Good. Several people were asking about what's going on in your model with transportation and building electrification. How much of those things are you assuming in your demand forecast? And if we move more vigorously in the direction of transportation and building electrification, what does that do to your model?
Yeah, that's a great question. We knew people would ask this, and it's a very important thing to model. So we basically, for our base case scenario, it does not include significant electrification. However, we modeled a high electrification future scenario, which is basically modeled off of NREL did this excellent electrification future study. So we took their high electrification scenario and assessed the kind of ran through this our model, and our results are quite encouraging. In fact, what we are finding is that the wholesale costs go down even further with electrification, and we are still digging into the results. But I think our hypothesis is that with electrification, the seasonal matching of load to generation actually improves. And of course, renewables are so inexpensive in the out years that doing more electricity or having more throughput reduces cost. Again, those are not definitive answers, but what we are finding is that it could potentially reduce the cost even further.
Well, you hit on the magic word cost, and I'm going to ask a couple of questions that people ask related to costs and what your model incorporates into the results and what it doesn't. First, in terms of transmission, how are transmission costs calculated, and how is transmission costs incorporated into your projection of future energy costs? And then let me ask a second question. You could tackle this as well, and that had to do with the cost of the policies you're promoting. How are the costs of those policies built into the price of the power, or is that held outside of the power costs, including such things as the cost of some of the job training and workforce development programs you're talking about?
Let me take the first one, and I can give a back of the envelope on the second one, and Rick and Michael, of course, please jump in. So we look at, so one of the things we had anticipated is that this a renewable case would include significant additional transmission costs. So then just comparing generation cost does not give the whole picture. Renewables could have a lower generation cost, but it has significant higher transmission costs, then we are not doing a good comparison. So what we did, we basically included the generation cost and incremental transmission costs. So incremental transmission costs are essentially the delta transmission costs of between the two scenarios, and what is built new. So you can't view the results as a generation plus transmission cost, but to make the comparison more accurate, we counted the incremental transmission costs, and essentially those are we just to give you an estimate, those are about 70 we find that the the 90% clean case has $70 billion worth of additional, or 70 or 80 billion dollars worth of additional transmission cost, and those are primarily in the spur line costs, which are basically used to connect the remote renewables to load center. So in a way, it does kind of take into account transmission costs to correct for the difference between a no new policy case and a clean case. And we don't explicitly, so when we impose a 90% constraint, whatever costs that are incurred, whether it's storage or transmission or higher stop and start costs or whatever, all those are in the model. All those are accounted for. What we have not accounted for are the costs of kind of retraining and things like that. And Michael can address some of those questions as well.
Yeah, thanks. The only thing I would add is just that where you're seeing coal plants come offline faster than anticipated, especially under a clean energy standard that was newly enacted, securitization can really help reduce those costs. In Colorado, they actually paired securitization legislation with the Just Transition assistance package, and I don't know that it included job training or not, but you know, the investment in coal communities was more than offset by the reduced cost of lower financing on the coal plants. So there's a savings opportunity there that you can then, you know, package together to fund some of the transition work and support those communities and allow them to take advantage of the opportunities created by the Clean Energy Standard.
Yes,
Yeah,
and in terms of depreciation, oh yeah, go ahead, Rick.
well, I was going to say exactly the same thing you were about to say, Amol, which is just to be very clear that we absolutely included the costs of, you know, the undepreciated value of any coal plants that we retired early. So we got really good data from RMI on the undepreciated, even though, as you all know, most of the thermal plants in this country are quite old. You know, there's still undepreciated balance on many of them because of environmental upgrades or other capital improvements that have been made. So we absolutely took those into account, and we also absolutely took into account the fixed costs of carrying, you know, over 400 gigawatts of the gas fleet. So there's no, we're not, while, you know, our costs didn't include policies per se, because we didn't explicitly like include a PTC or an ITC. We just had a mandate, right, a clean energy standard, like an RPS. But all the costs were included in that. Like we didn't, you know, we included the depreciation costs of retiring assets before they were fully depreciated. We included the fixed carrying costs of gas plants that may only operate at 20% or 10% capacity factor.
So this is a conservative approach. I think there is further cost optimization, Paul. Just to give you guys a back of the envelope, there are about $100 billion worth of undepreciated costs for coal that are in the model that are accounted for as depreciation cost as those assets are depreciated.
Good. Let's turn to the topic of batteries and battery technology. We had several questions about that. One person asked whether your model was, and I'm going to ask all these questions and let the three of you decide who wants to respond to which of them. One person asked whether your model assumes lithium-ion battery technology, or are you assuming that cheaper battery technologies and storage technologies that are under development will be available? Second, one person asked, well, what's the duration of the storage that you are modeling in terms of hours of available storage? And then someone who actually seems to have read the report said your 90% scenario involves the addition of 150 gigawatts and 600 gigawatt hours of 4-hour storage nationwide. But when that person went to the online data explorer, they saw essentially zero energy storage additions in your scenario for ISO New England. Can you explain why you're not showing storage in that region? So that's several storage questions.
Let me take the first two, and the last one I think we have to kind of dig into the data and we'll definitely follow up. On the first two, we are not assuming, we wanted to take a conservative approach and not assume kind of a lot of new technology. So we wanted to kind of give a higher bound on the cost estimate. So we basically, this is all lithium ion storage. Essentially what is assumed in the annual technology baseline for projected by NREL, other costs. And it's all short duration storage. It's basically 4-hour, 150 gigawatt of storage. That is not to say that we don't believe that the new technologies will not be developed and cannot further reduce the cost. Absolutely. I think there is so much exciting stuff that's happening that could further reduce the cost. But for the purposes of this model, we wanted to take a conservative approach. So lithium ion, no new technology development, 4 hours, 150 gigawatts. Now, as far as the question on the why we don't show storage, essentially the model is doing a national level optimization, abiding by the transmission limits for the 300 transmission connections we model. So we really need to kind of dig into that and see, maybe New England has a very good combination of certain resources that
Right.
doesn't require that kind of storage, but I think we really need to dig into it, but we'll be happy to, I mean, that's the follow-up we really want to do, is to dig
Right.
into the state and the regional stuff and actually do a more serious study.
If I can just add on ISO New England, this is Rick. The main reason you don't see a lot of storage at ISO New England is because there's not a lot of solar, and storage is really well paired with solar to essentially move solar generation from peak solar to later parts of the day or when it's needed most. ISO New England is got a pretty low share of solar. One of the cool things about the Data Explorer is you can actually look and make different assumptions. So if you assume lower costs, so if you assume like the ATB low, you'll actually see that more solar gets installed in ISO New England, and then more storage actually will get installed as well. So it is a really part of the generation mix. It's exactly what Amol was saying, is that different generation mixes are gonna, and you're gonna end up with, you'll see those changes in the across the regions. So.
Okay, this is a question for Mike about the policy suite you were discussing. Why are carbon markets and carbon prices not in the recommended policy suite?
So I wouldn't view that, the absence of that, as a recommendation that it not be pursued. The policies really are focused on the electricity sector and complementary policies to support that. Now, I do, of course, recognize that a carbon price would really help to tip the scales toward renewables, especially relative to the BAU case. And perhaps Amol and Rick, you guys can talk about the research that you've done looking into the impact of a carbon price. But it's really, it is a great complement to all of the policies we've discussed, but was it just sort of viewed as beyond the scope rather than something we don't agree with.
Yeah, and in terms of the modeling, we did look at what the model does if you add a carbon price or a societal cost of carbon. We took some well-accepted trajectories of societal cost of carbon and kind of slowly ramped in the carbon price. What happens is that as soon as you put a price on carbon, the economic decision of dispatch shifts dramatically. So the model adds renewables far more dramatically than in a case of a 90% clean scenario. All it's saying is that if one actually takes into account the environmental costs, even partially, from a societal perspective, this is close to an optimal solution. So we did model it. We have to do more work in terms of exactly at what carbon price the decisions flip, but that's for follow-on work. The bottom line is, if you consider any kind of environmental costs, the decisions on dispatch and investment flip very rapidly, much more rapidly than we see in a 90% clean case.
Well, I want to go back towards your early slides, which were talking about, they were very striking, and a couple of listeners wrote about them, showing how rapidly the projected cost of renewables has been falling. And so can you offer any insight as to why that's happened? Why has it fallen faster than expected? What were the big drivers? Do you expect that to carry forward? And that you even had a PPA price for 2020 for wind and solar that, as a starting point, that actually now seems higher than what it actually is.
Let me take that, but I think Rick and others, please jump in. I think the reason that has, if you look at the history of kind of clean energy technology, all cost projections, I have not seen, like predominantly they have been conservative, and probably that is because it doesn't take probably into account that once the technology gets cheaper, more gets deployed, and that further reduces the cost. There are a lot of kind of wildcard innovations that it's hard to anticipate. So if you look at, I mean, this is not just true for solar, it's also been true for wind and storage and several other technologies. And whether it will continue to decline this fast in the future, as you can see, we are probably making the same mistake. We are again saying, okay, the cost cannot remain flat in the future. Again, that's based on NREL, and they have very good explanation of what so the rate of decline that we are projecting based on NREL in the future, it's much flatter than what it has been. And we could be totally wrong about this, and that will be very nice. If the costs are actually lower than what we say they are, I think their future looks even brighter. But it's not going to make a huge difference to the kind of wholesale power cost results, because the costs are already so low that a 50% reduction over 2.5 cents is still only 1.25 cents. In the grand scheme of things, yes, it is a different result, but not very different.
Yeah, I mean, this is Rick. I would just add, I mean, there's a lot of, we're really focused on the system here, and we're not technologists sort of predicting, solar and wind costs, or even, backcasting and looking back as to why it happened. There's been a lot of literature on why it happened, and around learning curves, around the fact that, especially for solar PV, it's modular technology. So, I think we can think there's been, good policy. That's exactly what Amol was talked about, sort of, it created demand, which led to supply. So there's a lot of reasons why costs are falling, but I think the important thing is that they've sort of fallen to a point now where we're no longer relying on future cost declines, but there's still future cost declines are still there, right? We look at especially solar prices here in the US, utility scale solar prices in India are half that of the US, and residential solar prices are a third of US prices in places like Australia and Germany, which are not low-cost countries by any means. So there's still room, I think, for prices to come down. But I think the important takeaway is that we're not relying on those. It's no longer, I think 10 years ago it was like, hey, folks, and many of your states did, right? They took a bet. They passed a renewable portfolio standard. They said, take a bet. We think these are going to be cost competitive. Well, I think this report makes it pretty clear that those days have arrived. We are here.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll give all of you an opportunity to say any famous last words if there's anything you want to add. So the last question I'm going to ask, one of our listeners wrote in, is what implications might your study have for the goal of totally decarbonizing the energy system in all sectors, all uses by mid-century? Can we draw anything from what you say about the electricity system here to an understanding of how one might want to proceed with those other sectors?
Yeah, I can quickly answer that, and others can jump in. I think it actually brings us a lot of hope. I feel that one of the things that at least worried me personally is, yes, you can technically electrify, but if the cost of the clean electricity system are significant, then the probability of you electrifying those sectors from a cost economics perspective is very low. So you could have a 4.5 cents per kWh 90% clean power, just raises the prospect of ability to electrify. The other thing I would say is that this is carbon or climate emissions is a stock problem. So the faster we do it, the better it is. So power sector getting cleaned up earlier, so we can actually electrify all other sectors with a clear conscience. There is no this debate about, well, on the margin, whether we are going to increase emissions or not. So I think it's kind of the blood going through our energy system. It's basically, if that's clean, if that's then we can actually, expand its use. So I think it bodes quite well. And some of the trends that are driving this is like battery storage, cost dropping applies to transport. So it is creating interesting opportunities for electrification, cost-effective electrification in other sectors.
Yeah, I think I agree with all that. I just want to add to Amol. I mean, I think it really drives home the point that interim targets matter and that we should really focus. The whole point of this report was really saying, hey, we have technology. We have the technology today at the right price to get us pretty close to where we need to get to, and pretty quickly. So now we have, as like Amol said, right, the clean blood to clean up other sectors. So, but there are other voices out there, right? So those of you aware of like Duke, the largest utility in the country, Duke, has come out with a very different vision of the future, right? So they're only saying they're going to get to 50% by 2030. And they're, instead of sort of relying on low cost renewables to decarbonize their system, they're relying on technology that is not available, that they have created an acronym for. So, there are competing visions out there, and I think that, those competing visions have yet to prove, I think we've pretty definitively proved that this pathway is a pretty easy, straightforward pathway that we can take with existing technology, relatively straightforward policy. And, I think interim targets matter, and cleaning up the grid quickly matters. So we shouldn't take the approach, the sort of, well, let's go slow and wait for this other technology, whether it be small modular nuclear or, carbon capture and sequestration, all which are very important technologies. We're probably going to need them at some point, but we know that we have the technology that we need to get most of the way we have today. And so I think it's really important that's, I think, a key takeaway message. Sorry, Mike, you were going to say something.
That's okay. I'll be brief, and this can be my closing remark as well. I think the study also shows that, we don't need to keep digging a hole in terms of new natural gas infrastructure and power plants. So I would just note that as an overarching principle of transition. Really don't need new natural gas. We can use the existing fleet to balance the grid to get us to 90%, and then that gas system will be mostly depreciated, and we can kind of wind it down, at least on the generation side. The other thing I'll note is just that energy innovation also has an economy-wide model of the U.S. that looks at the interaction of different policies, and we have a net zero by 2050 scenario, which a 100% clean energy electricity standard by 2045 is a part of. And so this is really on track with other complementary policies and a carbon tax or a carbon price, to someone else's point, and policies to decarbonize other sectors. This is very much, complementary or on the path to getting there. So, the fact that it is lower cost than today, it should really help increase the ambition of policymakers in terms of what can be done.
Thank you, Mike. Amal and Rick, do either of you have any additional closing remarks you want to make?
Yeah, I just have one closing remark. Thanks. I really appreciate people listening in. I feel that given what has happened to costs and given how urgent it is to address climate change, I think, what does success look like? I think success looks like a bunch of ambitious enough interim targets, whether it's 80%, 90%, clean by 2030 or 2035 in key states and regions. That will really drive success. So I think it's upon us, now that the costs have fallen and the technology is here, it's upon us to establish those targets and give a clear signal to the market and to the investment community, which can even further bring down the cost. So that's what success looks like, an 80 to 90% target in the 2030 to 35 timeframe in key states and regions.
Yeah, and I think this is Rick. My closing statement was like Mike's previous, exactly what Amol just said. It's the importance of interim targets cannot be overstated.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground, and it's nice to have a hopeful message these days. So I at least appreciate that, and I'm sure the many people on this call appreciate all the excellent analysis you've done, and thank you for sharing your time with us today. So with that, we'll close this webinar, and we'll look forward to many of you joining us on future webinars with the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative and other programs of the Clean Energy States Alliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye now.